March 2008, the mangled remains of 39-year-old Michael Reed were discovered in a garbage compactor at the Cedar Ridge Municipal Waste Facility in Cedar Ridge, Missouri. An investigation uncovered the shocking details of Michael's affair with his co-worker, Sarah Miller, and the mounting jealousy of his wife, Deborah. A series of events that began in the February 2008 within the seemingly peaceful town would spiral into a deadly act of betrayal and revenge. Cedar Ridge, a quiet town with tree-lined streets and closely knit neighbors, seemed like the perfect place for Michael Reed and his wife Deborah to build their lives. Michael, 39, was the kind of man who always had a warm smile for everyone he met. He'd worked as a garbage truck driver for nearly 2 decades, a job he approached with quiet pride. Cedar Ridge residents admired him for his reliability. They saw him as a dependable figure who had built his life on honest, hard work. But beneath his steady demeanor, Michael harbored a growing dissatisfaction with his life. Deborah, 38, was the backbone of their household. A homemaker with sharp wit and a strong will, she had sacrificed her ambitions to create a stable home for Michael and their 2 children, who were now in their early teens. For years, she had been Michael's biggest supporter, cheering him on through long shifts and tough times. Yet, the years hadn't been kind to their relationship. Financial struggles and the monotony of routine had taken a toll. Their conversations often turned into arguments about bills, their children's future, or the increasingly distant looks Michael would give her at the dinner table. By 2007, their marriage had grown stale. Michael began staying out later than usual, claiming his shifts were running longer. Deborah dismissed her suspicions at first, chalking it up to the stress of their circumstances. She clung to the memory of the man she had married, believing that whatever was driving a wedge between them would pass. But as the months wore on, Deborah noticed changes in Michael, small but unmistakable. He started taking better care of his appearance, shaving every morning and dabbing on cologne before work. He even bought a new watch, something he hadn't done in years. Enter Sarah Miller. At 31 years old, Sarah was fresh-faced, vivacious, and full of energy. A stark contrast to the exhausted workers she joined on the garbage collection crew. Sarah had moved to Cedar Ridge just a few months earlier, looking for a fresh start after a messy divorce. She brought with her an infectious laugh and a knack for charming those around her. Her co-workers quickly took to her, especially Michael. Their connection began innocently enough, sharing coffee before their shifts, swapping jokes to pass the time, and complaining about the early mornings became part of their routine. But as the weeks went by, those conversations deepened. Sarah confided in Michael about her struggles, the heartbreak of her divorce, her loneliness in a new town, and her dreams of starting over. Michael, feeling increasingly unappreciated at home, found her attention intoxicating. By December 2007, their bond had crossed a line. It started with lingering glances, and Sarah playfully touching Michael's arm as they talked. Soon, those small moments turned into stolen hours after their shifts, spent at Sarah's modest apartment on the outskirts of town. They convinced themselves that their relationship wasn't hurting anyone, that it was just an escape from their respective hardships. Deborah began noticing more and more inconsistencies. Michael's explanations for his absences became vague and dismissive. He started guarding his phone, something he had never done before. When she asked him about his behavior, Michael would brush her off, accusing her of imagining things. Still, Deborah's intuition told her something was wrong. Everything came to a head on the February 14th, 2008, Valentine's Day. Deborah had spent the morning tidying up their modest home and preparing a simple dinner, hoping to reignite a spark between them. While folding laundry, she discovered a small, heart-shaped locket tucked into Michael's work jacket. It was shiny and new, and engraved with the words 2S. Deborah's heart sank as the realization hit her. This wasn't hers, nor did it belong to their teenage daughter. It was clear evidence of something she had long feared. Rather than confront Michael immediately, Deborah decided to investigate. Over the next few days, she began piecing together his life outside their home. She checked his call logs and found frequent calls to an unfamiliar number. She even followed him one evening after his shift, watching from a distance as he stopped at a local diner with Sarah, laughing and leaning in closer than a married man should. By February 20th, 2008, Deborah had enough proof to confirm her suspicions. But instead of confronting Michael, she let her anger simmer, choosing to observe him closely. Michael, unaware of her discovery, continued his double life. At home, he played the role of a hard-working husband, but his thoughts were consumed by Sarah. They talked about running away together, escaping Cedar Ridge, and starting fresh somewhere far away. To Michael, Sarah was everything he thought was missing from his life. A chance to feel young and desired again. Deborah, however, was no fool. She started noticing subtle changes in Sarah too. At local events, Sarah seemed too comfortable around Michael, her laughter too familiar. Deborah's sharp eyes took it all in, every interaction feeding her growing rage. She had always been a practical woman, one who prided herself on keeping her family together. But this betrayal cut deep. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about how easily Michael was willing to throw away everything they had built. As February turned into March, the tension in the Reed household became unbearable. Deborah's silence wasn't one of acceptance, but of planning. She knew the moment for confrontation would come, but when it did, it would be on her terms. Unbeknownst to Michael, his life was heading toward a dark and irrevocable turning point. And as Cedar Ridge went about its quiet routines, Deborah prepared for what would come next, her resolve growing stronger with each passing day. By early March 2008, the fragile threads holding Deborah Reed's life together finally snapped. For weeks, she had lived in silent torment, watching her husband Michael slip further away from her grasp. The proof of his betrayal, a collection of text messages, photos, and that locket she had found on Valentine's Day, was a constant reminder of the man he no longer was. Deborah, once a proud and self-assured woman, now felt consumed by humiliation and anger. She had dedicated herself to Michael and their family for 15 years, only to find herself discarded like yesterday's trash. Her discovery of the affair had ignited something dark within her. At first, Deborah had hoped Michael would realize his mistake and return to her, begging for forgiveness. But as the days passed, her hopes turned to fury. Watching him act as though nothing was wrong, smiling and carrying on, was like a knife twisting in her chest. Every morning when he left for work, she would seethe, picturing him laughing with Sarah. Deborah's children, sensing the tension in the house, kept their distance. The once warm and lively home had grown cold and quiet. In her solitude, Deborah's thoughts turned darker. She began reliving every fight, every time Michael had dismissed her concerns, every lie he had told. The anger built into a pressure she could no longer contain. On March 3rd, 2008, the dam broke. Deborah waited for Michael in the kitchen, armed with the evidence she had collected. When he walked in, she wasted no time confronting him. The tension that had been simmering for weeks erupted into an explosive argument. Deborah's voice shook with rage as she laid bare her accusations. Michael, caught off guard, tried to deflect, but Deborah's evidence was undeniable. The argument escalated until Michael, frustrated and cornered, grabbed his coat, and stormed out of the house. As the door slammed behind him, Deborah stood in the kitchen, shaking with a mixture of fury and despair. Her thoughts spiraled into dangerous territory. Michael's betrayal wasn't just a wound to her pride. It felt like a complete erasure of everything she had sacrificed for him. In her mind, his affair wasn't just an act of selfishness. It was a rejection of the life they had built together. That night, Deborah made a chilling decision. If Michael wanted to live a new life, he wouldn't live at all. The morning of March 6, 2008, began unremarkably. Michael left for his shift as usual, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing in Deborah's mind. It was a clear, crisp day in Cedar Ridge, and the hum of garbage trucks echoed through the streets as residents went about their routines. Michael and Sarah, oblivious to the danger lurking nearby, started their garbage route. They chatted and laughed, their camaraderie as natural as ever. Deborah, however, was anything but calm. She had spent the past few days meticulously planning her revenge. She knew Michael's route and schedule by heart, thanks to years of hearing him talk about his work. Armed with a tire iron she had taken from the garage, Deborah climbed into her car and drove to a secluded stretch of their route. She parked at a distance, waiting for the perfect moment. Around 8:30 a.m., Michael and Sarah's truck stopped to clear a jam in the compactor. Michael stepped out to investigate, his back turned to the road. Deborah seized her opportunity. Gripping the tire iron tightly, she approached with a determination that felt both terrifying and liberating. In her mind, this was justice, not just for the affair, but for all the ways Michael had made her feel small and insignificant. The blow was swift and brutal. Michael collapsed instantly, crumpling to the ground in a heap. Blood pooled beneath his head as the tire iron clattered onto the pavement. Deborah stood over him, her chest heaving, as a sickening mix of rage and triumph coursed through her. Sarah, hearing the commotion, rushed out of the truck. The sight before her froze her in place. Michael's lifeless body, and Deborah still holding the weapon. Deborah turned to Sarah, her eyes blazing with an intensity that silenced any protests. Without saying a word, Deborah gestured for Sarah to help. The message was clear. If Sarah wanted to keep her affair a secret, she would do as Deborah said. The dark irony of Deborah's plan was not lost on her. Michael, who had spent decades hauling other people's trash, would now become just another piece of garbage to be disposed of. She ordered Sarah to help lift Michael's body into the compactor. Trembling, Sarah complied, tears streaming down her face. The body was heavy, but adrenaline and fear drove them both. Once Michael's body was inside, Deborah activated the compactor. The sickening crunch of machinery filled the air as the compactor did its job. Deborah watched with cold detachment, her emotions numbed by the enormity of what she had done. For her, this wasn't just murder. It was the ultimate act of reclaiming power. To avoid suspicion, Deborah instructed Sarah to drive the truck to its next scheduled stop and continue the route as though nothing had happened. Deborah returned home, her hands shaking as she washed the blood from her skin and clothes. The tire iron, still stained, was tucked away in the garage, hidden but not forgotten. For the residents of Cedar Ridge, it was just another Thursday. But for Deborah, it was the day she had taken control of her life in the most horrific way imaginable. The morning of March 7th, 2008, began like any other for the sanitation workers at the Cedar Ridge Municipal Waste Facility. The air was thick with the sour stench of garbage as trucks arrived to unload their hauls. Among the workers was 54-year-old Tony Vega, a quiet man who had been working at the facility for over 20 years. That day, Tony was tasked with performing routine maintenance on one of the compactors, a job he had done hundreds of times before. As he opened the compactor to clear a jam, Tony's heart sank. Among the usual refuse, something caught his eye, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a dark mass tangled with shredded garbage bags and streaked with blood. At first he thought it was an animal, but as he looked closer, he realized the horrifying truth. The mangled remains of a man lay amidst the trash. Panic spread quickly through the facility as workers gathered, their murmurs mixing with the hum of machinery. The foreman immediately called the Cedar Ridge Police Department, and within an hour, the area was cordoned off, with officers swarming the site. The gruesome discovery shocked the small town, and whispers of foul play began to circulate. Detective Harold Norris, a veteran investigator known for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts, arrived at the scene. At 11:15 a.m., Norris began meticulously examining the remains. Even for someone with his years of experience, the sight was unsettling. The victim's body showed signs of blunt force trauma, and the compactor had obscured many identifying features. However, one detail stood out: a distinctive tattoo on the victim's forearm. It was a design Detective Norris had seen before: Michael Reed. Norris immediately began piecing together a timeline. Michael's wife, Deborah, had reported him missing the previous evening, claiming he hadn't returned from his shift. The garbage truck assigned to his route had been found at its usual drop-off point, parked neatly, with no signs of struggle inside. The detective's gut told him this wasn't a random accident. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure Michael's body ended up in the compactor. The first step was to talk to Michael's colleagues, starting with Sarah Miller. When Norris interviewed Sarah at the sanitation office later that afternoon, her nervousness was palpable. She avoided eye contact and fidgeted with her hands, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by a haunted look. Under the pressure of Norris's questions, Sarah cracked. She admitted to her affair with Michael, recounting their plans to leave Cedar Ridge together. However, when pressed about Michael's death, she denied any knowledge, insisting she hadn't seen him after their shift on March 6th. Despite her denials, Norris noted the tremor in her voice and the guilt in her eyes. Sarah was hiding something. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Norris turned his attention to Deborah. On the March 9th, he visited the Reed household to speak with her. From the moment he arrived, Norris sensed something was off. Deborah greeted him with forced politeness, but her eyes were cold, her movements stiff. She spoke about Michael's disappearance in a detached manner, almost as if she were rehearsing lines. While she claimed to be distraught, her behavior told a different story. Deborah explained that she had last seen Michael the evening of the March 3rd, when they had argued about his late hours. She claimed he left the house after their fight and hadn't returned. Norris noted the inconsistencies in her story. She described the argument in detail, but struggled to recall what Michael was wearing or what time he had left. It was a small detail, but one that didn't sit right with the detective. Over the next week, Norris dug deeper into Deborah's background. He spoke with neighbors and acquaintances, piecing together a picture of a woman who had grown increasingly erratic in recent months. One neighbor recalled seeing Deborah sitting in her car near Sarah's apartment late at night, while another mentioned hearing heated arguments between Deborah and Michael. The pieces began to fall into place. Deborah wasn't just a grieving wife. She was a woman consumed by jealousy and rage. On March 15th, Norris obtained surveillance footage from traffic cameras near the sanitation route. The footage, grainy but clear enough, showed Deborah's car driving behind Michael's garbage truck on the morning of March 6th. The timestamp 8:27 a.m. matched the approximate time of Michael's death. It was the break Norris needed. Armed with this evidence, Norris secured a warrant to search Deborah's home. On March 20th, the police descended on the modest house. In the basement, they found the damning evidence: a pair of blood-stained gloves, Michael's missing work jacket, and the tire iron Deborah had used to strike him. The weapon was unmistakable, its handle still bearing smudges of Michael's blood. Tucked away in a corner of the basement was a box containing photographs and printouts of Sarah's social media pages, each one defaced with angry scribbles and crossed-out faces. As the officers cataloged the evidence, Deborah stood in the doorway, her face pale, but her expression defiant. She didn't resist as she was placed under arrest, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The neighbors watched from their porches as she was led to the waiting police car, whispers of disbelief rippling through the crowd. For Detective Norris, the case was far from over, but the pieces were finally coming together. The evidence painted a chilling portrait of Deborah Reed, a woman whose love had turned into obsession, whose heartbreak had curdled into revenge. Yet even as the case moved forward, Norris couldn't shake the lingering question: what had driven her to take that final, irreversible step? The arrest came on the March 22nd, 2008, a gloomy Saturday morning that seemed to reflect the somber nature of what was about to unfold. Detective Harold Norris, alongside two uniformed officers, arrived at Deborah Reed's home with an arrest warrant in hand. Deborah had spent the past few days in relative isolation, her once fiery demeanor replaced by a hollow quietness. To the neighbors, she appeared grief-stricken, but Norris knew better. The evidence stacked against her left little doubt that her sorrow was not for Michael, but for herself. As the officers approached the door, Deborah didn't resist. She stood silently, her face pale and expressionless, as they handcuffed her and read her rights. The scene was surreal for the quiet town of Cedar Ridge, where police sirens were a rare occurrence. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering in disbelief. The Reed house, once a symbol of a seemingly ordinary family, now stood as the epicenter of a scandal that would haunt the town for years. Deborah was taken to the Cedar Ridge Police Department, where she remained stoic during questioning. She refused to confess, insisting on her innocence despite the mountain of evidence. But the blood-stained tire iron, the surveillance footage, and the damning testimony from Sarah Miller painted a grim picture. Deborah's silence was not a defense, but a resignation to the fate she knew was inevitable. The trial began on May 5th, 2008, and it quickly became a media spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, their cameras capturing every development. The case was dubbed the Garbage Truck Affair, a name that both trivialized and sensationalized the tragedy. Reporters from across the country descended on Cedar Ridge, eager to tell the story of the small-town wife turned murderer. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Carol Hensley, painted Deborah as a woman consumed by jealousy and rage. Hensley, a seasoned prosecutor, spared no detail in her portrayal of the crime. She described how Deborah had plotted the murder, lying in wait and striking with cold calculation. To the jury, she presented the blood-stained evidence and chilling photographs of the crime scene. Each detail was a reminder of the brutality of Deborah's actions. On the defense side was attorney Victor Mendez, a calm and composed lawyer who specialized in high-profile cases. Mendez took a different approach, portraying Deborah as a victim of circumstance. He argued that years of emotional neglect and Michael's infidelity had driven her to the edge. He emphasized the betrayal Deborah had endured, asking the jury to consider the psychological toll it must have taken on her. Mendez didn't deny the evidence, but sought to humanize Deborah, painting her as a broken woman rather than a cold-blooded killer. Sarah Miller's testimony was the most anticipated moment of the trial. Called to the stand on May 12, 2008, she appeared reluctant, her once vibrant personality subdued. Sarah recounted the events leading to Michael's death, her voice shaking as she described Deborah's attack and the aftermath. She admitted to helping dispose of the body, detailing how Deborah had threatened her into silence. Her testimony was raw and emotional, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Throughout the trial, Michael's family sat in the front row, a mix of grief and anger etched on their faces. His mother, an elderly woman with frail hands that clutched a photograph of her son, struggled to reconcile the image of the man she had raised with the secrets that had been revealed. Michael's siblings, their expressions stoic, attended every session, determined to see justice served. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours on May 19, 2008, a testament to the overwhelming evidence. When the verdict was announced, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom was silent for a moment before whispers rippled through the crowd. Deborah sat motionless, her face betraying no emotion, as if the weight of the verdict had already settled on her, long before the words were spoken. On June 2, 2008, Deborah Reed was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's voice was firm as he delivered the sentence, calling the crime a senseless act of violence born from anger and betrayal. Deborah stood silently as the gavel fell, sealing her fate. For Sarah, the end of the trial did not bring peace. Though she was spared criminal charges due to her cooperation with the investigation, the weight of her involvement in Michael's death hung over her like a shadow. Unable to face the whispers and judgment of Cedar Ridge, she left town shortly after the trial. She moved to a distant city, hoping to rebuild her life, but the scars of the past followed her. Every new relationship, every fleeting moment of happiness was tinged with the memory of that fateful day. Michael's family faced their own struggles. While they found solace in the verdict, it did little to ease the pain of losing him. The revelations of his affair and the scandal surrounding his death complicated their grief. They mourned not only the man they had lost, but the image of him that had been forever tarnished. Cedar Ridge, once a sleepy town where everyone knew each other, became infamous for the case. The garbage truck affair became a cautionary tale, a dark story told over coffee and in hushed tones at community gatherings. The Reed House, now empty, stood as a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Deborah, now an inmate at a state prison, spent her days in quiet reflection. She rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to herself and avoiding conflict. The woman who once commanded attention in her home was now just another face in the crowd, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. The echoes of the trial lingered for years, a chilling reminder of how love, betrayal, and rage could converge to shatter lives and leave an indelible mark on a once peaceful town. How far would you go for revenge? Could betrayal push someone over the edge into darkness? As Deborah's cell door closed for the last time, Cedar Ridge was left asking, could this happen to anyone, or was Deborah always destined